can the entire story of the deadliest conflict in human history really be told in 2 hours? Between 1939 and 1945, more than 70 million people died, empires collapsed, borders were redrawn, and the world was forever changed. It was a war fought on every continent except Antarctica, in the snows of Russia and the jungles of the Pacific, in the deserts of North Africa and the skies over London. It was a war of tank columns and code breakers, of factories turned into weapons of mass production and cities reduced to rubble by firestorms. It produced monsters and heroes, sometimes in the same uniform, and it ended with the detonation of a weapon so powerful that it threatened to make war itself obsolete. How did it start? How did it spread from a single invasion in Eastern Europe to a truly global catastrophe? And how, in the end, did it conclude? In this video, we will find out. So without further ado, let's start at the beginning. The seeds of the Second World War were planted in the ashes of the First. When Germany signed the Treaty of Versailles in June of 1919, it was forced to accept responsibility for the war, surrender territory, drastically shrink its military, and pay staggering reparations to the victorious powers. For many Germans, the treaty was not a peace agreement, but a national humiliation, a diktat imposed by enemies who had never truly defeated the German army on its own soil. This resentment festered through the 1920s, worsened by hyperinflation that wiped out savings and, later, by the Great Depression that threw millions out of work. Into this atmosphere of anger and desperation stepped Adolf Hitler, an Austrian-born former corporal who had been wounded and gassed on the Western Front. Hitler joined the small German Workers' Party in 1919 and through sheer force of oratory and ruthless political maneuvering transformed it into the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party. After a failed coup attempt in Munich in 1923 known as the Beer Hall Putsch, Hitler spent just over a year in Landsberg prison, where he dictated Mein Kampf, laying out his ideology of racial hierarchy, territorial expansion, and virulent anti-Semitism. Released early, he rebuilt the party through the legal political process, exploiting the chaos of the Weimar Republic and the fear of communism among Germany's elites and middle class alike. By January of 1933, President Paul von Hindenburg, under pressure from conservative advisers who believed they could control him, appointed Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. Within weeks, the Reichstag fire gave Hitler the pretext to suspend civil liberties, and by March, the Enabling Act allowed him to rule by decree. When Hindenburg died in August of 1934, Hitler merged the offices of Chancellor and President, declaring himself Führer of the German Reich. He began openly rearming Germany in defiance of the Versailles Treaty, reintroducing conscription in 1935 and remilitarizing the Rhineland in 1936, a bold gamble that succeeded only because Britain and France, still scarred by the losses of the previous war, chose not to intervene. This policy of appeasement would define the years that followed. When Hitler annexed Austria in the Anschluss of March 1938, the international response was muted. When he demanded the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia later that year, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew to Munich and signed an agreement handing it over, famously declaring he had secured peace for our time. Hitler had other plans. In March of 1939, German troops occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia, revealing the promises made at Munich to be worthless. Britain and France finally drew a line, guaranteeing the independence of Poland, but would that guarantee actually mean anything when tested? On August 23, 1939, the world was stunned by the announcement of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, two regimes that had spent years denouncing each other as mortal enemies. Hidden within the pact was a secret protocol dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, with Poland to be split between the two powers. With his eastern flank secured, Hitler was free to move. In the early hours of September 1, 1939, German forces launched a massive invasion of Poland, deploying more than 1.5 million troops supported by tanks and aircraft in a new style of warfare that would soon be known as Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War. German dive bombers, the feared Junkers Ju-87 Stukas, screamed down on Polish positions, spreading terror alongside destruction, while fast-moving panzer divisions punched through Polish lines and encircled entire armies before they could organize a coherent defense. Poland's cavalry, though far more modern and tactically sophisticated than the myth of horsemen charging tanks would later suggest, simply could not match the speed and concentration of German mechanized forces. Britain and France, honouring their guarantee, declared war on Germany on September 3, 1939, but they could offer Poland no meaningful military assistance in time. On September 17th, Soviet forces invaded from the east in accordance with the secret protocol, crushing Poland between two totalitarian powers. By early October, Poland had ceased to exist as an independent state, partitioned between Germany and the Soviet Union. The Soviets soon carried out their own atrocities, including the Katyn massacre of thousands of Polish military officers and intellectuals in the spring of 1940, a crime the Soviet Union would deny for decades and only officially acknowledge in 1990. Poland's collapse was not the only conflict to erupt in that first winter of the war. Believing the moment opportune while the world's attention remained fixed on Poland, the Soviet Union demanded territorial concessions from Finland in the autumn of 1939, and when Finland refused, launched an invasion on November 30, 1939, beginning what became known as the Winter War. To the astonishment of nearly every military observer, the vastly outnumbered Finnish army, fighting on skis through dense forests and using the brutal Arctic winter to their advantage, inflicted staggering casualties on the invading Red Army, whose officer corps had been gutted just 2 years earlier by Stalin's paranoid purges, leaving many Soviet units led by inexperienced and poorly trained commanders. Finnish snipers, most famously Simo Häyhä, credited with hundreds of confirmed kills and nicknamed White Death by his Soviet adversaries, became legendary figures of asymmetric warfare, while entire Soviet divisions were encircled and annihilated along narrow forest roads in what Finnish troops called Motti tactics, cutting long strung-out Soviet columns into isolated freezing pockets that could be destroyed piecemeal. Finland's resistance, though ultimately unable to prevent a negotiated peace in March 1940 that ceded roughly 10% of Finnish territory to the Soviet Union, exposed serious weaknesses in Soviet military leadership and equipment that Hitler and his generals took careful, and as it turned out dangerously overconfident, note of when they began planning their own invasion of the Soviet Union the following year. What followed the fall of Poland was an eerie period historians call the Phony War, lasting through the winter of 1939 into the spring of 1940, during which France and Britain mobilized behind the Maginot Line, a supposedly impregnable string of fortifications along the Franco-German border, while relatively little combat occurred in Western Europe. Hitler, however, was not idle. In April 1940, Germany invaded Denmark and Norway in a combined operation designed to secure Swedish iron ore shipments and naval bases for the coming Battle of the Atlantic. Denmark fell in a single day. Norway resisted longer, aided by British and French expeditionary forces, but by June, the country was fully under German occupation, and King Haakon VII fled into exile in London. Then, on May 10, 1940, Hitler unleashed his forces westward. German armour advanced not through the heavily fortified Franco-Belgian border where the Allies expected the main thrust, but through the supposedly impassable Ardennes forest, catching French and British commanders completely off guard. General Heinz Guderian's panzer divisions crossed the Meuse River at Sedan and raced toward the English Channel, threatening to trap the entire Allied Northern Army group. The speed of the German advance shocked even Hitler's own generals. Within days, hundreds of thousands of British and French troops found themselves pinned against the coast near the port of Dunkirk. What happened next would become one of the most remarkable episodes of the entire war. Between May 26th and June 4th, 1940, in an operation codenamed Dynamo, a hastily assembled fleet of Royal Navy destroyers requisitioned civilian ferries, fishing boats, and even private pleasure yachts crossed the channel under constant air attack to evacuate the trapped Allied soldiers. Against all expectations, more than 338,000 troops were rescued, an outcome Winston Churchill, who had become Prime Minister only weeks earlier following Chamberlain's resignation, called a miracle of deliverance, while cautioning that wars are not won by evacuations. France, however, could not be saved. German forces swept south, and on June 14, 1940, Paris fell without a fight, its citizens watching in stunned silence as German troops marched down the Champs-Élysées. France formally surrendered on June 22nd in the very same railway carriage at Compiègne where Germany had signed its own surrender in 1918, a piece of theatre Hitler relished. France was divided into an occupied zone in the north and west, and a nominally independent collaborationist regime based in the spa town of Vichy, led by the aging World War I hero Marshal Philippe Pétain. Britain now stood alone. Hitler assumed Britain would seek terms. When Churchill refused, Hitler ordered preparations for Operation Sea Lion, an amphibious invasion of Britain, but German military planners knew that any cross-channel invasion required air superiority first. That set the stage for the Battle of Britain, fought in the skies over southern England from July through October of 1940. The Royal Air Force, though outnumbered, possessed critical advantages. The Spitfire and Hurricane fighters were excellent aircraft. Pilots were fighting over their own territory and could be recovered if shot down. And Britain had developed a chain of radar stations that gave early warning of incoming raids, allowing fighters to be scrambled with precision rather than flying costly standing patrols. German losses mounted steadily. In early September, in retaliation for a British bombing raid on Berlin, Hitler shifted the Luftwaffe's target from RAF airfields to London itself, beginning the Blitz, a sustained bombing campaign against British cities that would kill more than 40,000 civilians, but ultimately failed to break British morale or destroy the RAF's fighting capacity. By the end of October, with autumn weather closing in and losses unsustainable, Hitler indefinitely postponed Operation Sea Lion. It was the first major campaign of the war that Germany had failed to win, and it would not be the last time that British resilience, combined with a healthy dose of geography, would frustrate Nazi ambitions. While the air war raged over Britain, Italy's Benito Mussolini, eager to carve out his own empire and frustrated by his subordinate role to Hitler, launched an invasion of Greece from Albania in October 1940 and had already invaded British-held Egypt from Libya in September. Both campaigns went badly. Greek forces pushed the Italians back into Albania, and British Commonwealth troops under General Archibald Wavell routed the Italians in North Africa, capturing over 130,000 prisoners in Operation Compass. Mussolini's failures forced Hitler to divert German forces to rescue his allies, sending the newly formed Afrika Korps under a young, aggressive general named Erwin Rommel to Libya in early 1941, and launching a Balkan campaign in April 1941 that swiftly conquered both Yugoslavia and Greece. These diversions delayed Hitler's real strategic objective by weeks, a delay that some historians argue would prove consequential when winter arrived early on a much larger battlefield to the east. For Hitler had never abandoned his true obsession, the destruction of the Soviet Union and the conquest of living space for the German people in the East. Preparations for that invasion, one that would dwarf everything that had come before it, were already well underway. Named after the medieval Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, the operation would become the largest land invasion in human history, and it would set in motion a chain of events on the Eastern Front that would ultimately decide the outcome of the entire war. Before we cross into the war's next and even bloodier phase, it is worth pausing on just how much had already changed in less than 2 years. A conflict that began with the invasion of a single country in Eastern Europe had, by the summer of 1941, swallowed nearly the whole of continental Europe. Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg and France had all fallen under German occupation or control, while Italy dragged a reluctant empire into a war it was ill-equipped to fight. Britain remained defiant but increasingly dependent on aid from a United States that had not yet entered the conflict, supplying war material through the Lend-Lease Act signed into law in March 1941. The machinery of the Holocaust, though not yet operating at the industrial scale it would soon reach, was already grinding forward, with Jews across occupied Poland forced into ghettos in cities like Warsaw and Łódź, subjected to starvation, disease, and systematic humiliation, as Nazi planners debated the Jewish question with increasing radicalism. The war, in other words, had already reshaped the map and cost hundreds of thousands of lives, and it had not yet even reached its widest global scope. What came next would eclipse everything before it, drawing in the world's largest country, its most populous nation, and eventually its most powerful one. It is worth taking a moment here to look at the war beneath the waves, because while armies clashed across Europe, an entirely different battle had already begun in the cold waters of the Atlantic Ocean, one that would grind on for the war's full duration. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, who had commanded U-boats himself during the First World War, understood better than almost anyone in the German High Command that Britain's survival depended on merchant shipping bringing food, fuel, and raw materials across the Atlantic from North America. If that lifeline could be severed, Britain might be starved into submission without a single German soldier setting foot on its shores. Dönitz pioneered wolfpack tactics, coordinating groups of U-boats by radio to overwhelm convoy escorts, and by 1940 and into 1941, his submarines were sinking Allied shipping at a rate that alarmed even Churchill, who later admitted that the U-boat peril was the only thing that ever really frightened him during the war. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park, working to crack the German Enigma encryption machine, would eventually turn the tide of this hidden war, but that breakthrough was still to come. For now, the Atlantic remained a killing ground, and every ship that went down took with it not just sailors but the fuel, food, and weapons that Britain desperately needed to keep fighting. How long could an island nation survive on a diet of rationing and hope alone? That question would hang over the war for years to come. Meanwhile, across the Alps, Benito Mussolini's dream of a new Roman Empire was collapsing in real time, and it is worth understanding just how badly it collapsed to appreciate why Hitler felt compelled to intervene in the Mediterranean and the Balkans at all. Mussolini had watched Hitler's stunning victories in 1940 with a mixture of admiration and jealousy, reportedly telling his son-in-law and foreign minister, Galeazzo Ciano, that he needed a war of his own to sit as an equal at the peace table. His invasion of Greece in October 1940 was launched without adequate planning, poor logistics, and an underestimation of Greek resolve so severe that Italian forces were pushed backward into Albania within weeks. In North Africa, the humiliation was even sharper. British and Commonwealth forces, vastly outnumbered on paper, used speed, deception, and superior tactics to shatter Italian positions in Egypt and Libya during Operation Compass, taking so many prisoners that British soldiers joked they were measuring their captures by the acre rather than by the head count. It was this cascade of Italian failures that forced Hitler's hand. Sending Rommel and his Africa course to Libya in February 1941 committed German resources to a theatre Hitler had never wanted to prioritise, while the Balkan campaign that April, though swift and successful, still cost time and fuel that some of Hitler's own generals would later argue was sorely missed when Barbarossa's timeline slipped and the invasion of the Soviet Union began several weeks later than originally planned, pushing the campaign dangerously close to the brutal Russian winter. And what a campaign it would be. On June 22, 1941, in the pre-dawn darkness, Germany and its Axis allies, including Romanian, Hungarian, Finnish and Italian units, launched Operation Barbarossa along a front stretching more than 1,800 miles from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. It remains to this day the largest military invasion in the history of warfare, involving over 3 million Axis soldiers, more than 3,000 tanks and roughly 2,700 aircraft. Stalin, despite receiving numerous intelligence warnings from British, American, and even his own Soviet spy networks, refused to believe Hitler would break the non-aggression pact, and Soviet forces were caught catastrophically unprepared. German Army Group North drove toward Leningrad, Army Group Center pushed directly toward Moscow, and Army Group South advanced into Ukraine, aiming for the agricultural and industrial riches of the Donbass and eventually the oil fields of the Caucasus. The initial results were staggering. Within weeks, German forces had encircled and destroyed entire Soviet armies, taking hundreds of thousands of prisoners at Minsk, Smolensk, and later in a colossal encirclement near Kiev in September 1941 that captured over 600,000 Red Army soldiers, one of the largest single military encirclements ever recorded. For a brief, intoxicating moment, it appeared the Soviet Union might collapse entirely, just as Hitler's generals had confidently predicted before the invasion began. But the Soviet Union did not collapse, and understanding why is essential to understanding the entire remainder of the war. Stalin, recovering from what associates described as days of near catatonic shock after the invasion began, rallied the Soviet state with brutal efficiency, ordering the wholesale relocation of entire factories, along with their workers, thousands of miles eastward beyond the Ural Mountains, out of reach of German bombers and advancing armies. This staggering feat of industrial evacuation carried out under emergency conditions in the summer and autumn of 1941, allowed Soviet war production to resume and eventually surpass German output. At the same time, the vastness of Russian geography, the notoriously poor road network that turned to impassable mud during the autumn rains known as the Rasputitsa, and the sheer scale of distances involved began to strain German logistics to the breaking point. German trucks, tanks, and horse-drawn supply wagons for the Wehrmacht remained far more dependent on horses than popular imagination suggests, struggled to keep pace with the advancing spearheads. And then, as autumn turned to winter, the temperature began to drop, eventually plunging to levels German planners, expecting a campaign lasting only a matter of months, had never adequately prepared for. German soldiers, still wearing summer uniforms in November and December, suffered tens of thousands of frostbite casualties. Engine oil froze solid, rifle bolts jammed. It was, in the most literal sense, a war against the climate as much as against the Red Army. Army Group Center reached the outskirts of Moscow by early December 1941, close enough that forward reconnaissance units reported being able to see the spires of the Kremlin through their field glasses. It was, arguably, the closest Germany would ever come to winning the war outright. But on December 5, 1941, the Red Army launched a massive counteroffensive using fresh, well-equipped Siberian divisions that Stalin had gambled on transferring from the Soviet Far East, a gamble made possible because Soviet spy Richard Sorge had confirmed from Tokyo that Japan intended to strike south against the United States and Britain rather than north against the Soviet Union. The German offensive, exhausted, frostbitten, and dangerously overextended, was thrown back from the gates of Moscow in a stunning reversal that shattered the myth of German invincibility. Hitler, furious at the retreat, dismissed his army's commander-in-chief, Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch, and took direct personal command of the army himself, a decision that would have profound and often disastrous consequences for German military decision-making for the rest of the war, as an increasingly erratic Hitler began overriding the professional judgment of his most experienced generals. It's worth pausing here on just how personal and improvisational the North African campaign often was compared to the vast, grinding scale of the fighting further east. The Desert War, fought across Libya and Egypt from 1940 onward, has often been romanticized, even by participants on both sides, as a comparatively contained war, fought largely between professional soldiers in a nearly empty landscape, and Rommel himself developed a reputation, cultivated partly through his own gift for self-promotion and partly through grudging admiration from his enemies, including Churchill, who once praised him in the House of Commons as a brilliant and even chivalrous tactician, the so-called Desert Fox. This reputation, while not entirely undeserved on narrow tactical grounds, tends to obscure Rommel's full complicity in a regime whose broader war aims he served without serious objection for most of his career. The fighting itself swung back and forth across hundreds of miles of desert with dizzying speed, as supply lines stretched to breaking points on both sides, since neither Axis nor Allied forces could sustain offensives far from their railheads and ports without fuel, and water shortages bringing the advance to a halt, a rhythm of advance and retreat that earned the theatre the nickname the Benghazi Handicap among British troops, referencing the Libyan port city that changed hands multiple times over the course of the campaign. The failure to take Moscow in 1941 meant Germany now faced exactly what its military planners had feared most: a prolonged two-front war of attrition against an enemy with vastly greater manpower and, increasingly, vastly greater industrial capacity. And remarkably, the war was about to grow even larger still, because on the other side of the world, an entirely separate conflict was about to collide with it in spectacular fashion. That separate conflict had been building for a decade. Japan, an industrializing island nation with few natural resources of its own, had invaded Manchuria in 1931 and launched a full-scale war against China in 1937, a conflict marked by appalling atrocities, including the Nanjing Massacre, in which Japanese troops killed an estimated 200,000 to 300,000 Chinese civilians and prisoners of war over a period of roughly 6 weeks. By 1940 and 1941, Japan's leadership, dominated by an increasingly militaristic government aligned with an expansionist imperial ideology, sought to secure the oil, rubber and other raw materials of Southeast Asia to fuel its war machine, resources controlled largely by European colonial powers, now weakened or occupied by Germany, and by the United States, which had imposed a crushing oil embargo on Japan in the summer of 1941 in response to Japanese aggression in French Indochina. Japanese military planners led by figures such as Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who had studied in the United States and harbored real doubts about Japan's ability to win a prolonged war against American industrial might, nonetheless concluded that a surprise strike could cripple American naval power in the Pacific long enough for Japan to seize the resource-rich territories it needed and negotiate a favorable peace before the United States could fully mobilize. On the morning of December 7, 1941, Japanese carrier-based aircraft struck the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, in a devastating surprise attack that sank or damaged 19 ships, including all 8 battleships stationed there, destroyed nearly 350 aircraft, and killed over 2,400 Americans, most of them in a single catastrophic explosion aboard the USS Arizona. The attack achieved near-total tactical surprise, but it proved to be a strategic catastrophe of the first order for Japan. The American aircraft carriers, which would prove decisive in the Pacific War, happened to be at sea during the attack and survived untouched. And rather than intimidating the United States into a negotiated peace, Pearl Harbor united an American public that had been deeply divided over intervention into a nation almost universally committed to total victory. President Franklin D. Roosevelt called December 7th a date which will live in infamy in his address to Congress the following day, and the United States declared war on Japan within hours. Days later, in a decision historians still debate as one of the great strategic blunders of the war, Hitler declared war on the United States as well, honoring the Tripartite Pact with Japan, even though he was under no obligation to do so, and Japan had not consulted him in advance. Overnight, the industrial might of the United States, the largest economy on Earth, was fully committed to a war it had, until that moment, only supplied from the sidelines. The early months of the Pacific War brought Japan a string of stunning victories that briefly rivaled Germany's conquests in Europe. Japanese forces overran the Philippines, forcing the surrender of American and Filipino troops at Bataan in April 1942 and Corregidor in May, capturing tens of thousands of prisoners who would endure the brutal Bataan Death March, during which thousands died from starvation, disease, and outright execution along the 60-mile forced march. Singapore, the supposedly impregnable British fortress guarding the gateway to the Indian Ocean, fell in February 1942 in what Churchill called the worst disaster in British military history, with roughly 80,000 British, Indian, and Australian troops taken prisoner. Japanese forces swept through Malaya, Burma, and the Dutch East Indies, and by mid-1942, the Japanese Empire stretched from the Aleutian Islands near Alaska to the fringes of Australia and India. But the tide would begin to turn with surprising speed, and the instrument of that turn would be a battle fought entirely by aircraft launched from ships that, for much of the engagement, never came within sight of one another. Before that decisive battle, however, the United States delivered a symbolic blow of enormous psychological importance, even though its direct military effect was fairly limited. In April 1942, just 4 months after the humiliation of Pearl Harbor, 16 modified B-25 bombers under the command of Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle launched from the deck of the carrier USS Hornet, an aircraft never designed for carrier operations, in a daring one-way raid against Tokyo and other Japanese cities. The bombers caused only modest physical damage, and most of the crews, unable to return to the carrier, were forced to crash land or bail out over China, where local resistance networks helped many evade capture, though some fell into Japanese hands and were executed. Yet the raid shattered the Japanese public's assumption that the home islands were untouchable, forced a humiliated Japanese high command to divert resources toward home defense, and delivered a badly needed morale boost to an American public still reeling from months of relentless bad news across the Pacific. It also, some historians argue, contributed to Admiral Yamamoto's determination to force a decisive battle with the remaining American carriers as quickly as possible, setting the stage for the fateful gamble at Midway just weeks later. That battle was Midway, fought from June 4th to June 7th, 1942, and it stands as one of the most consequential naval engagements in world history. American codebreakers, having partially cracked Japan's naval cipher, learned in advance that Yamamoto intended to lure the remaining American carriers into a trap by attacking Midway Atoll, a tiny but strategically vital American outpost northwest of Hawaii. Forewarned, Admiral Chester Nimitz positioned 3 American carriers to ambush the ambushers. In a chaotic, fast-moving battle marked by missed opportunities, extraordinary luck, and the sacrifice of an entire squadron of American torpedo bombers that attacked without fighter escort and was virtually annihilated, American dive bombers caught Japanese carriers in the vulnerable window, while their decks were cluttered with fuel and ordnance during a hurried rearming operation. In the span of just a few minutes, American pilots sank 3 Japanese fleet carriers. A 4th was sunk later that day. Japan lost not just irreplaceable ships, but hundreds of its most experienced pilots and aircrew, a loss from which its naval air arm never fully recovered. Midway did not end the war in the Pacific, which would grind on with ferocious island-by-island combat for 3 more years, but it permanently shifted the naval balance of power and put Japan firmly on the strategic defensive less than 6 months after Pearl Harbor. How quickly could an empire's fortunes change? At Midway, the answer was measured in minutes. As 1942 wore on, the war had become truly global in a way few conflicts in human history ever had. German U-boats prowled not just the mid-Atlantic but the very shores of the United States, where blackout measures were slow to be enforced and merchant ships burned in sight of American beaches during what U-boat crews grimly nicknamed the Second Happy Time. In North Africa, Rommel's Afrika Korps pushed deep into Egypt, coming within striking distance of the Suez Canal before being halted at the First Battle of El Alamein in July 1942. In the Soviet Union, having failed to take Moscow, Hitler shifted his 1942 summer offensive southward, aiming to seize the oil fields of the Caucasus and along the way the industrial city on the Volga River that bore Stalin's own name, Stalingrad. Few military planners on either side could have predicted that this single city would become the site of one of the most devastating battles ever fought, a battle whose outcome would mark the true turning point of the entire European war, and whose horrific casualty figures would come to symbolize the almost incomprehensible brutality of the Eastern Front. That story, along with the widening war in North Africa, the accelerating machinery of the Holocaust, and the beginning of the long, bloody road back across the Pacific, is where we turn next. By the summer of 1942, the German offensive in the Soviet Union, codenamed Case Blue, had split into 2 diverging thrusts, a strategic decision that violated the basic military principle of concentrating force, and one that some of Hitler's own generals argued doomed the campaign before it truly began. One army group pushed toward the Caucasus oil fields, while the 6th Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, drove towards Stalingrad, ostensibly to secure the flank of the Caucasus operation, but increasingly becoming an objective in its own right, partly because of the symbolic value Hitler attached to capturing a city bearing his rival's name. German forces reached the outskirts of Stalingrad by late August 1942, and what followed was months of brutal, close-quarters urban combat that came to be known with grim accuracy as the Rattenkrieg, or Rats' War, fought building by building, floor by floor, and sometimes room by room, in the shattered ruins of factories, apartment blocks, and the infamous Pavlov's house, a single apartment building defended by a small group of Soviet soldiers for nearly 2 months. Soviet General Vasily Chuikov, commanding the 62nd Army with its back literally against the Volga River, adopted a deliberate tactic of staying so close to German lines that German aircraft and artillery could not bomb Soviet positions without risking their own troops. While the 2 armies bled each other white in the city itself, Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov and General Alexander Vasilevsky secretly assembled massive reserves on the flanks of the German salient, where weaker Romanian, Hungarian and Italian units, poorly equipped and lacking adequate anti-tank weaponry, held the line. On November 19, 1942, the Red Army launched Operation Uranus, a massive pincer attack that smashed through these vulnerable flanks and, within 4 days, completely encircled the German 6th Army along with elements of the 4th Panzer Army, trapping approximately 250,000 Axis soldiers inside what became known as the Stalingrad Pocket. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, promised Hitler that his aircraft could supply the trapped army by air, a promise that proved catastrophically hollow given the scale of supplies required and worsening winter weather. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein attempted a relief operation, Operation Winter Storm, but it was halted well short of the encircled troops. Hitler forbade any attempt to break out, insisting the Sixth Army hold its position, and in a symbolic gesture on the eve of what he must have known was inevitable defeat, promoted Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal, pointedly noting that no German field marshal had ever surrendered, an unmistakable invitation for Paulus to take his own life rather than capitulate. Paulus, exhausted, his men starving, freezing, and out of ammunition, surrendered on January 31st, 1943, followed by the last pockets of resistance on February 2nd. Of the roughly 91,000 German and Axis soldiers taken prisoner at Stalingrad, only a few thousand would ever see Germany again. Most died in brutal Soviet captivity from disease, starvation, and forced labor in the years that followed. Stalingrad cost the Axis powers, by various estimates, somewhere between 500,000 and 850,000 casualties when accounting for the entire campaign, and it shattered forever the myth of German invincibility on the Eastern Front. It was, in the words of many historians, the true turning point of the war in Europe, the moment the strategic initiative permanently shifted to the Soviet Union, though nearly 2.5 more years of brutal fighting still lay ahead. Meanwhile, in North Africa, a parallel drama had been unfolding. In late October and early November 1942, British General Bernard Montgomery's 8th Army decisively defeated Rommel's Afrika Korps at the Second Battle of El Alamein, halting the Axis, advance into Egypt for good, and beginning a long retreat westward across Libya. Days later, on November 8, 1942, American and British forces landed in French North Africa in Operation Torch, catching Vichy French defenders by surprise and opening a new front that would squeeze Axis forces in Tunisia from both east and west. By May 1943, with Rommel already recalled to Germany on medical leave and unable to return, the remaining Axis forces in North Africa, numbering roughly 250,000 men, surrendered, a defeat some historians have called a Tunisgrad, a smaller but still significant echo of the disaster at Stalingrad. Would this be the moment German fortunes could ever recover? For Hitler's high command, the answer was becoming increasingly, grimly clear. It is impossible to tell the story of these years without confronting what was, simultaneously, unfolding in the occupied territories of Eastern Europe. The systematic industrialized murder of 6 million European Jews, along with millions of Roma, disabled people, Soviet prisoners of war, political dissidents, and others deemed enemies of the Nazi state. The persecution of Jews had been present in Nazi ideology and policy from the very beginning through discriminatory laws, forced emigration, and violent pogroms such as Kristallnacht in November 1938. But the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 marked a horrifying escalation. Mobile killing units known as Einsatzgruppen followed the advancing German army into Soviet territory, systematically rounding up and executing Jewish men, women, and children in mass shootings, the most infamous of which occurred at Babi Yar, a ravine outside Kyiv, where over 33,000 Jews were murdered in just 2 days in September 1941. By the time senior Nazi officials gathered at a villa in the Berlin suburb of Wannsee on January 20, 1942, for a meeting chaired by Reinhard Heydrich, the decision to pursue the final solution to the Jewish question through systematic extermination had, in practical terms, already been set in motion. The Wannsee Conference served largely to coordinate the bureaucratic machinery across various government ministries required to carry it out on a continental scale. What followed was the construction and operation of dedicated extermination camps, distinct from concentration camps in that their primary purpose was immediate mass murder rather than forced labor, though the two functions often overlapped and shifted over time at individual sites. Camps such as Auschwitz-Birkenau in occupied Poland, which combined a labor camp with purpose-built gas chambers and crematoria, Treblinka, Sobibor and Belzec, became sites of murder on a scale that strains human comprehension, with victims transported by rail from across German-occupied Europe, often told they were being resettled to maintain compliance until the very last moments. At Auschwitz alone, estimates suggest over 1 million people were murdered, the overwhelming majority of them Jews, though the camp system there also claimed the lives of Poles, Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, and others. The scale and mechanized efficiency of the Holocaust distinguishes it even among history's many genocides, representing the deliberate application of modern bureaucratic and industrial methods, including railway logistics, chemical engineering, and systematic record-keeping, to the task of extermination. Resistance did occur from armed uprisings such as the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in April and May of 1943, where a small number of poorly armed Jewish fighters held off German forces for nearly a month before being crushed, to countless smaller acts of defiance, sabotage, and survival against overwhelming odds. Some non-Jewish Europeans risked and often lost their own lives to hide or rescue Jewish neighbours, acts of moral courage that stand in stark contrast to the collaboration and indifference shown by many others across occupied Europe. Turning back to the wider military picture, 1943 was a year in which the Axis powers found themselves increasingly on the defensive across every theatre of the war. In the Pacific, following the pivotal victory at Midway, American forces began a grinding campaign of island warfare aimed at rolling back Japanese conquests, one heavily fortified island at a time. The campaign for Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, which began in August 1942 and continued into February 1943, became a brutal test of attrition on land, at sea, and in the air, with both sides suffering heavy losses in a series of naval battles fought in waters so frequently strewn with sunken ships that sailors nicknamed the channel near the island Iron Bottom Sound. American Marines endured malaria, starvation rations, and ferocious jungle combat before finally securing the island, marking the first major Allied land offensive victory against Japan and the beginning of a slow, costly advance that would eventually be characterized by a strategy known as island hopping, in which American forces bypassed heavily fortified Japanese strongholds where possible, isolating and starving them of supply, while seizing more strategically vital and lightly defended islands to establish airfields and naval bases for the next leap forward. General Douglas MacArthur pursued a parallel strategy in New Guinea, while Admiral Chester Nimitz's forces advanced through the Central Pacific, a dual-axis approach that stretched Japanese defenses thin but also required an enormous sustained commitment of American industrial and military resources that only a nation of America's productive capacity could realistically sustain over years of brutal island-by-island fighting. Back in Europe, following the surrender of Axis forces in Tunisia, Allied planners debated where to strike next, ultimately settling on Sicily as a stepping stone toward the Italian mainland. The invasion of Sicily, launched in July 1943, succeeded within about 6 weeks, and the shock of the invasion, combined with mounting battlefield failures and the realization among Italy's own elite that Mussolini's leadership had become a liability rather than an asset, led the fascist Grand Council to vote no confidence in Mussolini on July 24th and 25th, 1943. King Victor Emmanuel III had him arrested the following day. Mussolini's successor, Marshal Pietro Badoglio, publicly maintained Italy's alliance with Germany while secretly negotiating an armistice with the Allies, which was announced on September 8, 1943. German forces, who had anticipated exactly this betrayal, rapidly disarmed Italian troops and occupied most of the country, while a daring German commando raid led by Otto Skorzeny rescued Mussolini from his mountain prison in the Gran Sasso Massif and installed him as the puppet ruler of a new Nazi client state in northern Italy, the Italian Social Republic, based at Salo on Lake Garda. What followed in Italy was nearly 2 more years of grinding, costly Allied advance up the mountainous Italian peninsula against determined German defensive lines, including the brutal battles around Monte Cassino in early 1944, a campaign that would tie down significant German forces but progress at an agonizingly slow pace through some of the most difficult terrain in Europe. It was during this same stretch of the war that Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack who had always harbored private doubts about Japan's ability to win a prolonged war against American industrial capacity, met his own end in a moment that showcased just how thoroughly American codebreakers had penetrated Japanese military communications. In April 1943, American intelligence intercepted and decrypted a detailed itinerary for an inspection tour Yamamoto planned to make of forward Japanese bases in the Solomon Islands, and on April 18, 1943, American P-38 Lightning fighters, flying an extraordinarily long-range interception mission from Guadalcanal, ambushed and shot down Yamamoto's transport aircraft over the jungle of Bougainville, killing him instantly. The operation, personally approved by President Roosevelt, represented one of the most direct and consequential uses of decrypted intelligence to target a specific individual in the entire war, and Yamamoto's death, kept secret from the Japanese public for over a month to preserve morale, deprived Japan of its most capable and internationally respected naval strategist at a moment when the war in the Pacific was turning decisively against it. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, Hitler gambled on one final major offensive to regain the initiative he had lost at Stalingrad, targeting a prominent bulge in the Soviet lines around the city of Kursk in an operation codenamed Zitadelle. German planners had originally intended to launch the attack in early spring 1943, while Soviet defences around the bulge were still relatively thin, but repeated delays driven in part by Hitler's insistence on waiting for larger numbers of the new Panther and Tiger tanks to reach the front, despite persistent mechanical unreliability in the Panther's early production models, pushed the actual attack back to July, giving Soviet forces months of additional time to construct some of the most elaborate defensive works of the entire war, arranged in successive belts stretching back nearly 100 miles in some sectors and incorporating minefields laid at densities many times greater than typical Eastern Front defences. The Battle of Kursk, launched in July 1943, became the largest tank battle in history, with thousands of armoured vehicles clashing across the steppe in engagements of staggering scale, including the enormous armoured collision near the village of Prokhorovka. Soviet intelligence, however, had detected German preparations well in advance, allowing the Red Army to construct deep, layered defensive belts of minefields, anti-tank ditches, and artillery positions that absorbed and blunted the German armoured spearheads before they could achieve a breakthrough. When German forces became bogged down and Allied landings in Sicily forced Hitler to divert forces westward, he called off the offensive. The Red Army then launched its own counter-offensive, and from that point forward, the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front never again returned to Germany. Soviet forces began a slow, remorseless advance westward that would not stop until it reached the ruins of Berlin itself, a nearly 2-year campaign marked by both extraordinary Soviet sacrifice, with Red Army casualties over the course of the entire war eventually numbering in the tens of millions, and by acts of brutal retribution that would themselves leave a dark historical legacy across Eastern and Central Europe as Soviet forces advanced into German territory. It's worth asking, at this stage of the story, a question that lingers over the entire German war effort in the East. Why did the Wehrmacht, despite its tactical brilliance at the operational level, ultimately prove unable to translate individual battlefield successes into a war-winning strategy? Part of the answer lies in a persistent tension between military professionalism and ideological fanaticism that ran through the entire German high command. Officers like Heinz Guderian, the pioneering armour theorist whose pre-war writings on concentrated tank warfare had helped shape Blitzkrieg doctrine, repeatedly clashed with Hitler over strategic priorities. Most notably, when Guderian argued unsuccessfully in 1941 that the German offensive should continue directly toward Moscow rather than diverting armour southward to encircle Kyiv, a diversion that produced a spectacular tactical victory, but, in the view of many historians since, cost Germany the additional weeks that might have proven decisive in front of the Soviet capital before winter arrived. Guderian was dismissed later that same winter after disagreeing with Hitler over the retreat from Moscow, only to be recalled in 1943 to help rebuild Germany's shattered panzer forces after Stalingrad, a pattern of talented officers being alternately relied upon and discarded based on Hitler's shifting moods and his growing conviction, especially after 1942, that his own strategic instincts were superior to those of his professionally trained general staff, a conviction that events would repeatedly and catastrophically disprove. By the closing months of 1943, the strategic picture had transformed almost beyond recognition from the dark days of 1940 and 1941. Germany and Japan were now fighting defensive wars on multiple fronts against enemies with vastly superior combined industrial capacity, while the Allied powers, the United States, the Soviet Union, and the British Commonwealth, however uneasy their political alliance, coordinated an increasingly sophisticated combined strategy. At the Tehran Conference in November 1943, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met for the first time as a trio to plan the war's endgame, agreeing on a timeline for a long-promised second front in Western Europe, a massive amphibious invasion of Nazi-occupied France that would finally open the direct path toward Germany from the west that Stalin had been demanding for over 2 years. Planning for that invasion, which would become the largest amphibious assault in military history, was already well underway, and its success or failure would determine whether the war in the West could be brought to a swift conclusion or would drag on for years more. That invasion, along with the desperate final German gambles it would provoke, forms the next great turning point in our story. While armies clashed on land, an equally decisive struggle was reaching its climax far out in the Atlantic Ocean. The spring of 1943 became known to U-boat crews as Black May, a catastrophic month in which Allied forces, now equipped with long-range aircraft that could close the mid-Atlantic air gap, where U-boats had once operated with relative safety, along with improved radar, sonar, and the ongoing code-breaking work at Bletchley Park that allowed convoys to be rerouted around wolf packs before they could even strike, sank more than 40 German submarines in a single month. Admiral Dönitz, who had lost his own son to the U-boat war, was forced to withdraw his boats from the North Atlantic convoy routes almost entirely. A tacit admission that the Battle of the Atlantic, waged continuously since the war's opening days, had finally been lost by Germany. It was a quiet defeat compared to the thunder of Stalingrad or Kursk, but its consequences were enormous because it guaranteed that the flow of American troops, tanks, aircraft and supplies across the Atlantic to Britain, the essential precondition for any future invasion of France, could now proceed with dramatically reduced risk. Without victory in the Atlantic, there could be no D-Day. And without the codebreakers, the long-range bombers and the tens of thousands of merchant sailors who kept sailing despite horrific losses earlier in the war, that victory would never have come at all. Above the cities of Germany itself, another campaign was intensifying, one whose morality and effectiveness remain hotly debated by historians to this day. The Allied Strategic Bombing Campaign. The Royal Air Force's Bomber Command under Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris pursued a strategy of nighttime area bombing intended to destroy German industrial capacity and break civilian morale, a strategy that produced horrifying results such as the firestorm that consumed Hamburg in July 1943, killing an estimated 37,000 people in a single week of raids as superheated air created hurricane-force winds that fed the flames. The United States Army Air Forces, meanwhile, favored daylight precision bombing of specific industrial and military targets, though the accuracy of such bombing was, particularly in the war's earlier years, far less precise than the term suggested, and American bomber crews paid a horrific price for it, particularly during unescorted deep penetration raids into Germany, such as the missions against ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt in 1943, where loss rates sometimes exceeded 20% of aircraft dispatched on a single mission. The introduction of long-range fighter escorts, most notably the P-51 Mustang equipped with drop tanks that extended its range all the way to Berlin and back, eventually allowed Allied bombers to establish air superiority over Germany itself by early 1944, a development that would prove absolutely critical to the success of the invasion of France that lay just months away, since it denied the Luftwaffe the ability to contest Allied air power over the invasion beaches. Let's pause here on a question worth asking. How did Germany, fighting a two-front war against enemies with vastly greater combined industrial output, manage to sustain the fight for as long as it did? Part of the answer lies in the remarkable, if morally horrifying, mobilization overseen by Armaments Minister Albert Speer, who dramatically increased German war production even as Allied bombing intensified, in part through the ruthless exploitation of millions of forced laborers and concentration camp prisoners brought into German factories and mines under conditions that killed enormous numbers of them through overwork, malnutrition, and abuse. Part of the answer also lies in genuine tactical and technological sophistication, from the superb optics and armour of German tanks like the Panther and Tiger, to innovations such as the Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, which entered service too late and in too few numbers to affect the outcome, but which offered a chilling glimpse of what the next generation of warfare might look like. And part of the answer lies simply in the fanatical, ideologically driven determination of the Nazi regime, and a significant portion of the German population to fight. On long after the war was, by any rational military calculation, already lost, a determination reinforced by genuine fear of what defeat and Soviet occupation might bring, fear that, given the conduct of German forces in the East, was in many respects entirely justified. Returning to the Italian campaign, the fighting around Monte Cassino between January and May of 1944 became one of the most grueling and controversial engagements of the entire war. A historic Benedictine monastery perched atop a commanding hill overlooking the main road to Rome, Monte Cassino anchored the formidable German Gustav Line, and Allied commanders, believing German troops were using the monastery itself as an observation post, ordered its complete destruction by bombing in February 1944, reducing centuries of religious and cultural heritage to rubble, an action historians now generally agree was based on flawed intelligence, since German forces had in fact been respecting the monastery's neutrality until the bombing itself provided ready-made rubble and fortified positions that German paratroopers then occupied and defended with tenacious skill. It took 4 separate major offensives and contributions from a remarkably multinational Allied force, including American, British, French, Polish, and other Commonwealth troops, before the position finally fell in May 1944, with Polish forces achieving the decisive breakthrough and raising their flag over the ruined abbey in a moment of fierce national pride for soldiers fighting far from a homeland that remained under brutal German and increasingly anticipated Soviet occupation. Rome itself fell to Allied forces on June 4, 1944, a significant symbolic victory that was almost immediately overshadowed, just 2 days later, by an invasion of even greater magnitude unfolding hundreds of miles to the north. It's worth stepping back from the front lines for a moment to consider the war being fought far from any battlefield. The war of factories, farms, and finances that ultimately determined how long each side could keep fighting at all. The United States, insulated from bombing and blessed with enormous natural resources, underwent an industrial transformation almost unmatched in history. Converting automobile plants to build tanks and aircraft, launching cargo ships in a matter of days at shipyards employing revolutionary prefabrication techniques, and drawing millions of women into factory work, memorably symbolized by the cultural icon Rosie the Riveter, even as the US economy simultaneously supplied enormous quantities of trucks, aircraft, food, and raw materials to Britain and the Soviet Union through the Lend-Lease program, a lifeline Soviet marshals would later credit as materially important to sustaining the Red Army's offensive capabilities. Britain, despite enduring years of bombing and rationing, similarly mobilized its population with remarkable thoroughness, while the Soviet Union, having relocated its industrial base beyond the Urals in the desperate months of 1941, achieved a wartime production of tanks and aircraft that eventually outpaced Germany's own output. A staggering achievement given the devastation the Soviet economy had already suffered from German occupation of some of its most productive territory. Germany, by contrast, was slower to fully mobilize its economy for total war, a delay historians attribute partly to Hitler's initial reluctance to impose hardships that might dampen civilian morale, and partly to the sheer administrative chaos of a regime built on competing, overlapping bureaucracies that often worked at cross purposes with one another. Resistance movements, meanwhile, sprang up across occupied Europe, ranging from organized armed groups conducting sabotage and guerrilla warfare, such as the French Resistance, Yugoslav partisans under Josip Broz Tito, and Polish Home Army, to smaller networks providing intelligence to the Allies, hiding refugees and downed airmen, and publishing underground newspapers to counter Nazi propaganda. These movements operated under constant threat of brutal reprisal. German occupation forces frequently executed dozens or even hundreds of civilians in retaliation for a single act of resistance, as occurred in the Czech village of Lidis in 1942, which was entirely destroyed and its male population murdered in retaliation for the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich by Czechoslovak agents trained in Britain. Yugoslavia's partisan resistance under Tito grew into a genuine liberation army, numbering in the hundreds of thousands by the war's end, tying down substantial German and collaborationist forces that might otherwise have reinforced other fronts, while in the east, Soviet partisans operating behind German lines disrupted supply lines and gathered intelligence at enormous cost, since German anti-partisan operations were often conducted with a ferocity that made little distinction between armed fighters and ordinary civilians. It is worth noting, too, that Germany's own military increasingly relied not just on native German manpower, but on foreign volunteers and conscripts recruited into the ranks of the Waffen-SS, the armed wing of Heinrich Himmler's SS organization, which by the war's end had grown to include dozens of divisions drawing recruits, some genuinely ideologically motivated and others coerced or opportunistic. from occupied countries including Belgium, the Netherlands, Norway, Ukraine, and the Baltic states, a multinational force whose post-war fate, scattered between Allied captivity, quiet reintegration, and in some notorious cases outright escape from justice, remains its own remarkable story. Turning back to the codebreakers whose work quietly shaped so much of what happened on the battlefield, the effort at Bletchley Park in England, where mathematicians and cryptanalysts including Alan Turing developed increasingly sophisticated methods and machines, most famously the electromechanical bomb, to break the German Enigma cipher, represents one of the great untold stories of the entire war, one that remained officially secret for decades after 1945. Intelligence derived from decrypted German communications, codenamed Ultra, informed Allied decisions ranging from the routing of Atlantic convoys around U-boat wolfpacks to advanced knowledge of German dispositions before major battles, though Allied commanders had to use such intelligence with extreme care to avoid tipping off the Germans that their codes had been compromised, sometimes making the agonizing choice to allow attacks to proceed uninterrupted, rather than risk revealing the source of their foreknowledge. Winston Churchill reportedly told King George VI after the war that it was thanks to Ultra that the war had been won, an assessment some historians consider an overstatement, but one that nonetheless reflects just how significant the code-breaking effort had become to Allied strategic planning by the war's final years. How many lives were saved and how many months or years were shaved off the war's duration by intelligence gathered in the unassuming huts of an English country estate? It is a question historians still debate, but few dispute that the answer is measured in the hundreds of thousands at minimum. By the spring of 1944, all of these threads, industrial mobilization, code-breaking intelligence, hard-won air superiority, and years of meticulous planning, were converging toward a single, enormous undertaking along the coast of Normandy in northern France. Allied planners under the overall command of American General Dwight D. Eisenhower had spent more than a year preparing for the invasion, developing specialized armored vehicles nicknamed Hobart's Funnies to clear minefields and obstacles, constructing artificial mulberry harbors that could be towed across the channel to allow supply ships to unload even without a captured port, and running an elaborate deception operation, codenamed Fortitude, that used fake army camps, dummy tanks and landing craft, double agents, and phantom radio traffic to convince German intelligence that the main invasion would fall at Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel, rather than the beaches of Normandy, where it would actually strike. This deception proved so effective that even after the Normandy landings began, Hitler and much of the German High Command remained convinced for weeks that the true invasion was still to come at Calais, delaying the commitment of powerful reserve panzer divisions that might otherwise have thrown the invasion back into the sea in its most vulnerable opening hours. The stage was set for the largest amphibious invasion in the history of warfare, and its outcome would determine whether the liberation of Western Europe could proceed on anything resembling the timeline the Allies desperately needed. In the pre-dawn hours of June 6, 1944, a date that would forever after simply be known as D-Day, more than 5,000 ships and 11,000 aircraft supported the landing of approximately 156,000 Allied troops across 5 designated beaches along the coast of Normandy, codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Paratroopers from the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions and the British 6th Airborne Division had already dropped behind enemy lines in the darkness before dawn, tasked with seizing key bridges, causeways and gun positions to protect the flanks of the seaborne assault, though scattered drops caused by poor visibility and anti-aircraft fire meant many units landed far from their intended targets and had to improvise, fighting in small, disorganized groups that nonetheless caused enough confusion among German defenders to aid the overall operation. At Omaha Beach, American troops faced the most ferocious resistance of the entire invasion, pinned down on an exposed beach by a well-entrenched German infantry division under murderous machine gun and artillery fire from bluffs overlooking the sand, suffering roughly 2,000 casualties in the beach's first hours alone before small groups of soldiers, often acting on their own initiative after officers were killed or wounded, began working their way up the bluffs and breaking the deadlock. By nightfall, despite the horrific losses at Omaha, all 5 beachheads had been secured, and roughly 156,000 Allied troops had established a foothold on the European continent that German forces, hampered by the Fortitude deception, fuel shortages, and Hitler's own insistence on retaining personal authority over the release of reserve panzer divisions proved unable to dislodge. It is worth asking here just how close this entire enterprise came to failure, because the popular memory of D-Day as an inevitable triumph obscures how genuinely uncertain its outcome felt to the men actually planning and executing it. Eisenhower himself, on the eve of the invasion, drafted a private note taking full personal responsibility in the event the landings failed, a note he fortunately never had to release, and poor weather in the days before June 6th forced a tense, high-stakes decision to delay the invasion by 24 hours, gambling on a narrow window of improved conditions identified by his chief meteorologist, a gamble that also, unexpectedly, worked in the Allies' favour since German commanders, including Rommel, who had been placed in charge of coastal defences along the Atlantic Wall, judged the weather too poor for any invasion attempt, and Rommel himself had actually left for Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday and lobby Hitler in person for reinforcements, meaning he was not even present at his headquarters when the landings began. German command structure in the West was itself hampered by overlapping and poorly coordinated authority between Rommel, who favoured meeting any invasion at the beaches with concentrated armour, and his superior, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who favoured holding armoured reserves further inland to counterattack once the location of the main invasion became clear, a strategic disagreement that Hitler never fully resolved, and that arguably left German forces poorly positioned to respond decisively in the invasion's critical opening hours, regardless of which approach might have proven correct. The weeks that followed D-Day involved brutal fighting through the hedgerow country of Normandy, known as the bocage, where dense earthen banks topped with thick hedges divided the landscape into a maze of small fields that German defenders exploited superbly for ambushes, slowing the Allied advance and inflicting casualties disproportionate to the ground gained. The breakthrough finally came in late July 1944 with Operation Cobra, an American offensive that used a massive concentrated bombing of German lines, unfortunately including a friendly fire incident that killed dozens of American soldiers, including Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the most senior American officer killed by enemy action in the European theatre, before American armour punched through and began a rapid advance across France. General George Patton's newly activated Third Army exploited the breakthrough with characteristic aggression, racing across France so quickly that fuel supply rather than German resistance became the primary constraint on Allied advance. In August, a second Allied invasion, Operation Dragoon, landed forces in southern France near the Riviera, further squeezing German forces from the south. The cost of those weeks of fighting through Normandy's hedgerows is memorialized today in the vast American cemetery at Colville-sur-Mer overlooking Omaha Beach, where nearly 9,400 white marble crosses and Stars of David stand in careful rows alongside similar British, Canadian, German and Polish cemeteries scattered across the region. A landscape of remembrance that still draws millions of visitors each year to a stretch of coastline that, on a single morning in June 1944, changed the course of world history. Paris was liberated on August 25, 1944, with French General Philippe Leclerc's Free French Division given the honour of leading the entry into the city, a moment of profound symbolic importance for French national pride after 4 years of humiliating occupation, and Charles de Gaulle, leader of the Free French forces who had refused to accept France's 1940 surrender, walked triumphantly down the Champs-Élysées to the cheers of an ecstatic crowd, moving quickly to establish his authority as the legitimate leader of a liberated France and to prevent either a power vacuum or an Allied military government from filling the void. While Western Allied forces surged across France that summer, an even larger catastrophe was befalling the German army on the Eastern Front, one that remarkably remains far less well known in the West, despite its almost unimaginable scale. Launched on June 22, 1944, precisely 3 years to the day after Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Bagration was a massive Soviet offensive against German Army Group Center in Belarus, employing over 2 million Soviet soldiers, thousands of tanks, and overwhelming artillery superiority against a German force that had been stripped of reserves to reinforce the crumbling situation in Normandy and Ukraine. The results were catastrophic for Germany, arguably exceeding even the disaster at Stalingrad in absolute numbers. Army Group Center, one of the Wehrmacht's most powerful formations, was effectively annihilated, suffering losses estimated between 350,000 and 450,000 men in a matter of weeks, as Soviet forces achieved multiple massive encirclements and advanced hundreds of miles, liberating Belarus and pushing into Poland and the Baltic states. Bagration receives comparatively little attention in popular Western memory of the war, overshadowed by the drama of Normandy unfolding simultaneously, but many military historians consider it one of the most decisively successful offensive operations of the entire war, one that effectively destroyed Germany's ability to maintain a coherent defensive line in the east and opened the road toward Warsaw, East Prussia, and ultimately Berlin itself. It was against this backdrop of mounting military catastrophe that a group of German officers, diplomats, and civilian conspirators, many of whom had grown convinced over years that Hitler was leading Germany to total ruin and that removing him was both a patriotic and moral necessity, carried out the most serious assassination attempt against Hitler of the entire war. On July 20, 1944, Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg planted a briefcase bomb in a conference room at Hitler's Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia, then departed under a pretext before the device detonated. The bomb exploded, killing several officers and wounding others, but Hitler survived with only minor injuries, protected in part by the heavy wooden conference table leg that shielded him from the worst of the blast, and in part by the fact that another officer had unwittingly moved the briefcase further away from Hitler's position moments before detonation. The plot, known as Operation Valkyrie, unraveled within hours once word spread that Hitler had survived, and the conspirators, having already set in motion plans to seize control of Berlin and other key cities, found themselves without support once loyalist forces confirmed the Führer was alive. Stauffenberg and several co-conspirators were executed by firing squad that very night. In the brutal purge that followed, the Gestapo arrested thousands of suspected conspirators and sympathizers, many of whom were tortured and executed, including Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who was implicated, likely with some justification, in knowledge of the plot. Given his immense public popularity, Hitler allowed Rommel to take his own life with poison in October 1944, in exchange for a state funeral and the protection of his family, a grim bargain that spared the regime the embarrassment of publicly trying and executing one of its most celebrated commanders. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, 1944 brought a series of decisive American victories that steadily tightened the noose around the Japanese home islands. American forces under Admiral Nimitz captured the Mariana Islands, including Saipan, Guam, and Tinian, in mid-1944, victories of enormous strategic importance because the islands were close enough to Japan to serve as bases for the new long-range B-29 Superfortress bomber, which could now strike the Japanese home islands directly. The fighting for Saipan in particular was marked by horrifying scenes as thousands of Japanese civilians, indoctrinated by propaganda depicting American forces as monstrous, chose mass suicide by leaping from cliffs rather than surrender, a grim preview of the fanatical resistance and civilian tragedy that would characterize the war's final Pacific battles. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, fought alongside the Saipan invasion, saw American pilots so thoroughly annihilate Japanese carrier aircraft that the engagement became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a devastating blow from which Japan's carrier aviation, already weakened since Midway, never recovered. General MacArthur, fulfilling his famous 1942 promise to return to the Philippines after being ordered to evacuate as the islands fell to Japan, led the invasion of Leyte in October 1944, triggering the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history by tonnage engaged, in which Japan committed nearly its entire remaining naval strength in a desperate, multi-pronged gambit that ultimately ended in catastrophic defeat, destroying Japan's capacity to conduct large-scale naval operations for the remainder of the war. It was during this battle that Japan first employed organized kamikaze suicide attacks in which pilots deliberately crashed explosive-laden aircraft into Allied ships, a tactic born of increasing desperation and dwindling conventional resources that would inflict serious losses on Allied naval forces throughout the war's final year. Not every Allied gamble that autumn succeeded as cleanly as the breakout from Normandy. In September 1944, British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, eager to end the war before the year was out, and frustrated by what he saw as an overly cautious broad front strategy favoured by Eisenhower, proposed a bold plan to seize a chain of bridges across the Netherlands, culminating in a crossing of the Rhine at Arnhem, that would, if successful, open a direct path into Germany's industrial heartland and potentially shorten the war by months. Operation Market Garden, launched on September 17, 1944, combined the largest airborne assault in history with a rapid ground advance by British armour, but it unravelled due to a combination of overly ambitious planning, poor radio communications that left forward units unable to coordinate effectively, and the unlucky presence of two battle-hardened German SS Panzer divisions, refitting in the Arnhem area that Allied intelligence had failed to properly identify beforehand. British paratroopers of the 1st Airborne Division, dropped too far from their objective and reinforced too slowly, fought a desperate defensive battle at Arnhem for over a week, memorably summarised by the phrase, "a bridge too far," before being forced to withdraw with heavy losses, and the operation's failure meant the war in the West would grind on through a difficult winter rather than concluding, as Montgomery had hoped, before Christmas. Back in Europe, as autumn turned to winter in 1944, Hitler gambled once more on a bold offensive gamble in the West, hoping to replicate the stunning success of 1940 by driving through the same Ardennes forest that had proven so vulnerable 4 years earlier, this time aiming to split American and British forces, recapture the vital port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the West that would allow Germany to concentrate its remaining strength against the Soviets. Launched on December 16, 1944, in conditions of deliberately poor weather chosen to ground Allied aircraft, the offensive achieved considerable initial surprise against thinly held American lines, creating the famous bulge in Allied positions that gave the battle its popular name. American forces, particularly the besieged 101st Airborne Division, at the crucial road junction of Bastogne, held on under desperate conditions. When German forces demanded the surrender of the encircled American garrison, Acting Commander Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe famously replied with a single word, "Nuts," a response that had to be explained to bewildered German officers as an emphatic refusal. Clearing skies eventually allowed Allied air power to resume pummeling German columns, while Patton's Third Army executed a remarkable logistical feat, wheeling 90 degrees and driving north through winter conditions to relieve Bastogne. By late January 1945, the German offensive had been decisively repulsed, at the cost of irreplaceable German reserves of manpower, armour and fuel that had represented essentially the last significant strategic reserve Germany possessed in the West. The Battle of the Bulge would prove to be Germany's final major offensive of the war, and its failure guaranteed that the collapse of the Third Reich, though still bitterly contested, was now only a matter of time. Before the Battle of the Bulge, and while Operation Bagration was still reshaping the map of Eastern Europe, one of the war's most tragic episodes unfolded in the Polish capital. On August 1, 1944, the Polish Home Army, encouraged by the rapid Soviet advance and hoping to liberate their own capital before Soviet forces arrived, launched the Warsaw Uprising against the German occupation, expecting Soviet assistance from Red Army forces that had reached the eastern bank of the Vistula River, mere miles from the fighting. That assistance never meaningfully materialized. Stalin, for reasons that remain debated by historians, but likely included a calculated desire to see Polish nationalist resistance, which might have complicated Soviet plans to install a compliant communist government after the war, crushed by German forces rather than survive to challenge Soviet authority, halted the Red Army's advance and largely withheld support, even denying Western Allied aircraft attempting to airdrop supplies to the insurgents the ability to land and refuel at Soviet-controlled airfields. German forces, under direct order from Hitler to raze the city in retaliation, spent over 60 days crushing the uprising with extraordinary brutality, killing an estimated 200,000 Polish civilians and fighters, and then systematically demolishing the city block by block, leaving Warsaw more than 80% destroyed by the time Soviet forces finally entered in January 1945. It stands as one of the starkest illustrations of how the political calculations of the war's great powers could determine the fate of ordinary people caught between them, regardless of the courage those people displayed. As Soviet and later Western Allied forces advanced into German-controlled territory in late 1944 and early 1945, they began encountering direct, undeniable physical evidence of the Holocaust's true scale. Soviet troops liberated the Majdanek camp in July 1944, finding gas chambers, crematoria, and warehouses full of victims' shoes and belongings still largely intact. since retreating German forces had not had time to fully destroy the evidence, and Soviet forces later liberated Auschwitz-Birkenau on January 27, 1945. Finding roughly 7,000 surviving prisoners, most of them desperately ill, along with vast stores of victims' possessions that had been sorted for shipment back to Germany, testament to the camp's role not just in murder, but in the systematic plunder of its victims. Western Allied forces, advancing into Germany itself in the spring of 1945, liberated concentration camps, including Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, and Dachau, where they discovered scenes of horror that shocked even hardened combat veterans. Piles of unburied corpses, survivors reduced to living skeletons by starvation and disease, and evidence of medical experimentation and systematic cruelty that would soon become central evidence in the war crimes trials to follow. General Eisenhower, upon touring the Ohrdruf camp in April 1945, ordered that as many American soldiers as possible be brought to witness the camps firsthand, along with journalists and even local German civilians, reportedly stating that he wanted eyewitness testimony to survive so that no one could ever claim these atrocities were merely propaganda, a concern that, given the persistence of Holocaust denial in the decades since, proved tragically prescient. With Germany's defeat now only a matter of time, the war's three principal Allied leaders met again in February 1945 at Yalta, a Soviet resort on the Crimean Peninsula, to plan the post-war order. Roosevelt, visibly ailing and only 2 months from his death in April 1945, Churchill and Stalin negotiated the shape of post-war Europe, agreeing to divide occupied Germany into separate zones, administered by the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, to hold free elections in liberated Eastern European countries, a promise Stalin would systematically break in the years that followed, as Soviet-backed communist governments were installed across the region, and to have the Soviet Union enter the war against Japan within 3 months of Germany's defeat, in exchange for territorial concessions in Asia. The Yalta Conference has been criticized by later historians, particularly during the Cold War, as effectively conceding Eastern Europe to Soviet domination, though defenders of the agreement point out that Soviet military forces already physically occupied most of the region by the time of the conference, leaving the Western Allies with limited practical leverage to alter facts already established on the ground. The agreements reached at Yalta would shape the political map of Europe and the contours of the coming Cold War for the next 4.5 decades. In January 1945, the Red Army launched the Vistula-Oder offensive, a massive assault that shattered remaining German defences in Poland and advanced an astonishing distance, in some sectors covering more than 300 miles in barely 3 weeks, bringing Soviet forces to within striking distance of the Oder River, the last major natural barrier before Berlin itself. The speed of this advance stunned German commanders who had hoped the harsh winter terrain might slow Soviet momentum as it once had in 1941. And it reflected just how thoroughly the balance of manpower, equipment, and operational skill had shifted since the desperate early years of the German invasion. Stalin, ever attentive to the political value of military glory, deliberately fostered a fierce rivalry between his two most capable marshals, Georgy Zhukov and Ivan Konev, both racing westward with their respective army groups, a competition Stalin calculated would spur both men to greater speed and aggression in the final drive on the German capital, even at the cost of coordination and, ultimately, additional casualties among their own troops, as both commanders pushed hard to be first through Berlin's outskirts. By early 1945, Germany itself was beginning to disintegrate under the weight of the war it had unleashed nearly 6 years earlier. As Soviet forces pushed into East Prussia and Silesia, one of the largest forced population movements in human history began as millions of German civilians, terrified by propaganda and by all too real accounts of Soviet reprisals against German communities in retaliation for the horrors inflicted on Soviet territory during the German occupation, fled westward in brutal winter conditions, often on foot or in horse-drawn carts, a mass exodus that claimed the lives of untold thousands from exposure, starvation, and violence along the way. The sinking of the German ship Wilhelm Gustloff by a Soviet submarine in January 1945, as it attempted to evacuate refugees and military personnel across the Baltic Sea, killed an estimated 9,000 people, making it the deadliest single maritime disaster in history, a staggering toll that remains comparatively little known outside Germany and the former Soviet Union. Within Germany, Hitler ordered the mobilization of the Volkssturm, a desperate home guard militia drawing on boys as young as 12 and men well into their 60s, often armed with little more than obsolete rifles or single-shot anti-tank weapons to defend towns and cities against the advancing Red Army. A measure that reflected both the regime's fanatical refusal to acknowledge defeat and the catastrophic depletion of Germany's actual military manpower after years of grinding losses on multiple fronts. Among the senior military figures whose long and often decorated careers collapsed in these final catastrophic months were men like Field Marshal Walter Model, one of Hitler's most trusted defensive specialists, nicknamed the Führer's fireman for his repeated success in stabilizing collapsing fronts, who found himself commanding Army Group B as it was encircled in the Ruhr pocket in April 1945. Rather than surrender, Model dissolved his army group, released younger soldiers from their oaths, and took his own life in a forest near Duisburg on April 21, 1945, unwilling to face capture or the war crimes accusations that, given the brutal reprisal policies his forces had implemented in occupied Soviet territory and Italy, would very likely have followed him into an Allied courtroom. Other senior commanders fared differently. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the aristocratic senior-most field marshal in the German army who had commanded major campaigns from the invasion of Poland through the defense of France, was captured by American forces in May 1945. Though implicated in the brutal conduct of the war in both the East and West, ill health and questions over the sufficiency of evidence meant he was ultimately never brought to trial, and he was released in 1949, living out his remaining years quietly in West Germany until his death in 1953, a fate that struck many observers, then and since, as remarkably lenient given the scope of the campaigns he had directed. These divergent fates, suicide, capture, trial, quiet release, would repeat themselves again and again among the senior ranks of the collapsing Third Reich, a pattern of accountability applied with far less consistency than the scale of the war's crimes might suggest it deserved. Across the world in the Pacific, American forces in February and March of 1945 assaulted the small volcanic island of Iwo Jima, whose capture was deemed essential to provide an emergency landing strip for damaged B-29 bombers returning from raids on Japan and a base for fighter escorts. Japanese defenders under General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had constructed an extraordinarily elaborate network of underground tunnels, bunkers and fortified positions, abandoning the traditional Japanese doctrine of contesting the beaches directly in favor of a defense in depth designed to inflict maximum American casualties in a battle of pure attrition, since Kuribayashi held no realistic hope of actually repelling the invasion. The resulting battle, fought from February 19th to March 26, 1945, became one of the costliest in Marine Corps history, with nearly 7,000 Americans killed and over 19,000 wounded in the capture of an island barely 8 square miles in size, while virtually the entire Japanese garrison of over 20,000 men fought to the death, with fewer than 1,000 taken prisoner. The iconic photograph of Marines raising the American flag atop Mount Suribachi, taken by Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal, became one of the most famous images of the entire war, and later the basis for the Marine Corps War Memorial in Arlington. Though the flag raising it depicted was actually the second of 2 raisings that day, the first flag having been deemed too small to be easily visible from the beach below. The staggering casualty ratios at Iwo Jima offered American military planners a grim preview of what an actual invasion of the Japanese home islands might cost, a calculation that would weigh heavily on decisions made in the war's final months. That grim calculation grew even starker with the Battle of Okinawa, fought from April through June of 1945, the last and largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War, and the closest American forces had yet come to the Japanese home islands themselves, with Okinawa lying only about 340 miles from the southernmost main island of Kyushu. Japanese defenders, again employing a strategy of attrition from fortified cave and tunnel networks rather than contesting the beaches, inflicted horrific casualties over nearly 3 months of fighting, while the kamikaze campaign reached its terrifying peak, with over 1,900 suicide attacks sinking or damaging hundreds of American ships and killing thousands of sailors, the heaviest naval losses the United States Navy suffered in any single battle of the war. On land, American Army and Marine forces ground slowly through Japanese defenses in some of the war's most costly infantry combat, ultimately suffering over 12,000 killed, while Japanese military deaths exceeded 100,000 and, most tragically, an estimated 100,000 or more Okinawan civilians died in the crossfire from mass suicides encouraged by Japanese propaganda warning of supposed American atrocities and from being caught between two armies fighting through their homes, farms, and villages. The scale of civilian suffering at Okinawa, a Japanese prefecture with its own distinct culture and history that had long felt marginalized within the Japanese Empire, remains a source of complicated memory and resentment in Okinawa to this day. For American planners drawing up contingency plans for Operation Downfall, the anticipated invasion of the Japanese home islands themselves, Okinawa's casualty figures, extrapolated across a target of far greater size and population, suggested a human cost potentially running into the hundreds of thousands or even millions on both sides, a sobering calculation that would weigh directly on the decisions made in Washington over the summer of 1945, regarding a weapon unlike any that had ever existed before. Let's pause to ask a question worth sitting with. By the spring of 1945, was there ever a realistic chance for either Germany or Japan to negotiate an end to the war on terms less than total, unconditional surrender? For Germany, the Casablanca Conference of January 1943 had already established unconditional surrender as the Allied war aim, a policy that some historians have argued may have stiffened German resistance by removing any incentive to negotiate a way out short of total defeat, though defenders of the policy point to the horrific scale of German atrocities as more than sufficient justification for demanding nothing less than complete capitulation and regime change. For Japan, a faction within the government, including Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, had begun exploring the possibility of Soviet mediation to secure a negotiated peace by the summer of 1945, unaware that Stalin, honoring his Yalta commitment, was already preparing to enter the war against Japan, rather than mediate on its behalf. Militarist factions within the Japanese government and armed forces, meanwhile, remained committed to a fight to the finish, hoping that inflicting catastrophic casualties on any American invasion of the home islands, a strategy sometimes referred to as Ketsu-go, might yet secure more favorable surrender terms, including the preservation of the emperor's position and the imperial system itself, a concern that would prove central to the events of August 1945 and the final agonizing days before Japan's eventual capitulation. By April 1945, the once mighty Third Reich had been reduced to a shrinking pocket of territory around Berlin itself, squeezed between Soviet forces advancing from the east and Western Allied armies pushing in from the west, who had already crossed the Rhine River in March and were racing across central Germany, meeting Soviet troops at the Elbe River on April 25, 1945, in a symbolic link-up that effectively cut what remained of Germany in two. Hitler, having relocated to a concrete bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, presided over a surreal and increasingly delusional final act, ordering the movement of divisions that no longer existed, raging at generals for failures caused by his own catastrophic strategic decisions, and refusing, even as Soviet artillery shells began falling in the streets above his bunker, to countenance any evacuation or surrender. Soviet marshals Georgy Zhukov and Ivan Konev, whose forces had been encouraged by Stalin to compete for the prestige of capturing the German capital first, launched the final assault on Berlin on April 16, 1945, in the Battle of the Seelow Heights, a brutal engagement that cost the Red Army tens of thousands of casualties before German defences, manned increasingly by exhausted regular soldiers alongside Volkssturm militia and even Hitler Youth Boys, finally broke. Fighting inside Berlin itself over the following 2 weeks became house-to-house urban combat of the most desperate and savage kind, not unlike Stalingrad in miniature, but now with the roles reversed. On April 29, 1945, in his bunker, Hitler married his longtime companion Eva Braun in a brief ceremony and dictated his final political testament, in which he expressed no remorse for the war or the Holocaust, instead blaming Jews for having caused the conflict and expelling Hermann Göring and Heinrich Himmler from the Nazi Party for their perceived disloyalty in the war's final days, as both men had separately attempted to negotiate with the Allies without Hitler's authorization. The following day, April 30, 1945, with Soviet troops fighting only a few blocks from the Chancellery, Hitler and Eva Braun took their own lives, Hitler by gunshot and Braun by cyanide poisoning, and their bodies were carried outside to the Chancellery Garden, and burned according to Hitler's explicit instructions to prevent his corpse from being paraded or displayed by his enemies, as had happened to Mussolini, who had been captured by Italian partisans while attempting to flee to Switzerland just 2 days earlier and was executed along with his mistress, Clara Petacci, their bodies subsequently hung upside down in a Milan gas station for public display. A grim symbol of the popular fury directed at a regime that had dragged Italy into catastrophic and unnecessary war. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's fanatically loyal propaganda minister, succeeded Hitler as chancellor for barely a single day before he and his wife Magda made the horrifying decision to poison their 6 young children before taking their own lives as well, an act of familial murder-suicide that stands as one of the most chilling personal tragedies to emerge from the regime's final collapse, reflecting Magda's stated conviction that a world without National Socialism was not one she wished her children to inherit. Berlin's garrison surrendered on May 2, 1945. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, whom Hitler had named as his successor in his final testament, headed a brief rump government based in the northern town of Flensburg, and it fell to him to oversee Germany's formal capitulation. German representatives signed an unconditional surrender at Reims, France on May 7, 1945, effective the following day, and a separate ceremony was conducted in Berlin on May 8 at Soviet insistence, ensuring the Soviet Union received its own formal recognition of the victory it had paid for with such staggering sacrifice. VA Day, Victory in Europe Day, was celebrated with jubilant crowds flooding the streets of London, Paris, Moscow, and New York, even as the full scope of the horrors uncovered in the concentration camps was still being absorbed by a shocked public. The war in Europe, which had begun with the invasion of Poland nearly 6 years earlier, was finally over, at a cost that historians still struggle to fully calculate. Some 70 to 85 million deaths worldwide when accounting for both military and civilian casualties across all theatres, the Soviet Union alone losing an estimated 24 to 27 million people, a scale of sacrifice that shaped Soviet, and later Russian, national memory and foreign policy for generations afterward. But the war was not yet over everywhere. In the Pacific, despite the catastrophic losses at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, Japan's military leadership showed little sign of accepting the unconditional surrender demanded by the Allies at the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, where a newly installed American president, Harry Truman, who had assumed office upon Roosevelt's death in April, met with Churchill, soon replaced mid-conference by newly elected British Prime Minister Clement Attlee and Stalin to finalise plans for Japan's defeat and Germany's post-war administration. It was during this conference that Truman learned of the successful test on July 16, 1945, in the New Mexico desert of the world's first atomic bomb, the culmination of the top-secret Manhattan Project, a scientific and industrial undertaking of staggering scale that had employed well over 100,000 people and cost roughly $2 billion. Drawing on the theoretical breakthroughs of physicists including Albert Einstein, whose 1939 letter to Roosevelt had helped initiate American interest in atomic weapons research, and Robert Oppenheimer, the scientific director whose team at Los Alamos, New Mexico, designed and built the weapon itself. Faced with Japan's continued refusal to accept the Potsdam Declaration's surrender terms and weighing the projected catastrophic casualties of a full-scale invasion against the shocking but potentially war-ending power of this new weapon, Truman authorized its use. On August 6, 1945, an American B-29 bomber named Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, dropped an atomic bomb codenamed Little Boy on the Japanese city of Hiroshima, instantly killing an estimated 70,000 to 80,000 people, with tens of thousands more dying in the following months and years from burns, radiation sickness, and related injuries, bringing the eventual death toll to well over 100,000. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki after the original target city, Kokura, was obscured by cloud cover, killing an estimated 40,000 to 75,000 people. That same day, honouring the commitment made at Yalta, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched a massive invasion of Japanese-occupied Manchuria, rapidly overwhelming Japan's already depleted Kwantung Army and eliminating any remaining hope Japan's government might have harboured of securing Soviet mediation for a negotiated peace. Faced with the combined shock of the atomic bombings and the Soviet declaration of war, Japan's Supreme War Council remained deeply divided, with militarist factions still favoring continued resistance until Emperor Hirohito personally intervened to break the deadlock, an almost unprecedented direct exercise of imperial authority, and announced Japan's acceptance of the Potsdam Terms in a radio broadcast to the Japanese people on August 15, 1945, the first time most Japanese citizens had ever heard their emperor's actual voice. A group of militarist officers attempted a last-minute coup to prevent the surrender broadcast from airing, a failed uprising known as the Kyujo Incident, underscoring just how contested the decision to surrender remained even in its final hours. The formal instrument of Japanese surrender was signed aboard the American battleship USS Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945, bringing the Second World War to its definitive close. General Douglas MacArthur, presiding over the ceremony as Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, would go on to oversee the American occupation of Japan, implementing sweeping political, economic and social reforms that dismantled the wartime imperial system, introduced a new pacifist constitution and laid the foundation for Japan's remarkable post-war transformation into a stable democracy and economic powerhouse. Emperor Hirohito, controversially, was permitted to retain his throne, stripped of any claim to divine status, but preserved as a symbol of national continuity, a decision American occupation authorities judged essential to maintaining social order and facilitating a peaceful transition, even as it meant the emperor, in whose name Japan's wartime atrocities had been committed, would never face the kind of judicial reckoning imposed on Germany's surviving leadership. That reckoning, when it came for Germany, took the form of the International Military Tribunal convened at Nuremberg, the city that had once hosted the Nazi Party's most grandiose propaganda rallies, a choice of venue rich with symbolic justice. Beginning in November 1945, 22 senior surviving Nazi officials, including Hermann Göring, Wilhelm Keitel, Alfred Jodl, and Joachim von Ribbentrop, stood trial before judges representing the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, facing charges including conspiracy to wage aggressive war crimes, and the newly defined charge of crimes against humanity, a legal innovation developed specifically in response to the scale and character of Nazi atrocities. The trial, which concluded in October 1946, resulted in 12 death sentences, including for Göring, who cheated the hangman by taking a smuggled cyanide capsule mere hours before his scheduled execution, and for Keitel and Jodl, both hanged despite their pleas that they had merely followed orders, a defense the tribunal explicitly and influentially rejected as inadequate justification for participation in manifestly criminal acts. Others received lengthy prison sentences, served largely at Spandau prison in Berlin, including Rudolf Hess, Hitler's former deputy, who had made a bizarre solo flight to Scotland in 1941 in an apparent, unauthorized attempt to negotiate peace with Britain, and spent the rest of the war and decades afterward imprisoned, eventually dying in Spandau in 1987 as its last remaining inmate. Subsequent trials at Nuremberg and elsewhere prosecuted doctors, judges, industrialists, and lower-ranking camp officials, though the overwhelming majority of those who participated in the Holocaust and other Nazi crimes, including many who ran the day-to-day machinery of the camps and mass shootings, were never brought to justice at all, quietly reintegrating into post-war German or Austrian society, or in some notorious cases, escaping to South America along clandestine networks as Adolf Eichmann, the chief logistical architect of the Holocaust deportation system, did before being tracked down by Israeli intelligence agents in Argentina in 1960. And brought to trial in Jerusalem. The war's end also set the stage for the world that followed, a world reshaped almost as profoundly by the peace as it had been by the fighting itself. The United Nations was founded in October 1945, explicitly intended to prevent a repeat of the catastrophic failures of the earlier League of Nations in stopping aggression before it could spiral into global war. Europe found itself divided into a Western bloc aligned with the United States and an Eastern bloc under Soviet domination, a division formalized over the following years through the Marshall Plan's economic reconstruction of Western Europe and the establishment of communist governments across Eastern Europe, setting the stage for the decades-long Cold War standoff between the two emerging superpowers, whose wartime alliance of necessity had never been able to paper over deep ideological and geopolitical differences that resurfaced almost immediately once the common enemy was defeated. Germany itself was partitioned, ultimately hardening into two separate states, the Federal Republic of Germany in the west and the German Democratic Republic in the east, a division symbolized most starkly by the Berlin Wall erected in 1961 and one that would not be healed until German reunification in 1990. Japan, occupied and transformed, renounced war as a sovereign right under its new constitution's famous Article 9, while the decolonization movements accelerated by the war's disruption of European empires gathered unstoppable momentum across Asia and Africa in the decades that followed, as colonial subjects who had fought and died for empires that denied them basic rights increasingly, and often successfully, demanded independence. For the survivors of the Holocaust and other Nazi atrocities, the war's end brought liberation but rarely anything resembling a swift return to normal life. Many survivors found themselves classified as displaced persons, housed for months or even years in camps, some of them the very same facilities where they had been imprisoned, now administered by Allied military authorities struggling to cope with a refugee crisis of staggering proportions across a shattered continent. Many had lost their entire families and found, upon attempting to return to their pre-war homes in Poland, Hungary, or elsewhere in Eastern Europe, that their houses had been occupied by others, sometimes by neighbours who had participated in or profited from their persecution, and that anti-Semitic violence had not entirely ended with Germany's defeat, as tragically demonstrated by the Kielce pogrom in Poland in July 1946, in which a mob killed dozens of Jewish Holocaust survivors following a false rumour of ritual murder, an event that convinced many remaining Jewish survivors in Eastern Europe that there was no future for them in the lands of their birth. This reality accelerated Jewish emigration, both through legal channels and through clandestine networks smuggling survivors past British restrictions into mandatory Palestine, a movement of profound historical consequence that contributed directly to the political pressures culminating in the establishment of the State of Israel in May 1948, itself a development that reshaped the geopolitics of the Middle East for the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. It is worth dwelling a little longer on the individual fates of the men who sat in the dock at Nuremberg, because their divergent paths through that courtroom illustrate just how uneven the reckoning with Nazi crimes truly was. Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff of the Wehrmacht High Command and one of Hitler's closest military advisors throughout the war, was convicted on all 4 counts and hanged alongside Keitel in October 1946. Though in a small historical footnote, a German court posthumously reviewed his case in 1953 and controversially found that his actions, viewed strictly under German military law of the time, did not constitute a crime. A verdict that was itself later annulled, reflecting the ongoing and often uncomfortable process by which post-war Germany wrestled with how to judge the conduct of its own wartime military establishment. Albert Speer, the architect who had risen to become Hitler's armaments minister and one of the most powerful men in the wartime German economy, adopted a strategy at trial of expressing general remorse and accepting collective responsibility for the regime's crimes, while carefully avoiding detailed admissions about his specific knowledge of the Holocaust and the horrific conditions endured by the forced and slave labourers under his ministry's authority, a performance that many historians now believe was substantially more calculated and less honest than it appeared to the tribunal at the time. It worked. Speer received a 20-year sentence rather than the noose, served it at Spandau alongside Hess, and emerged in 1966 to write best-selling memoirs that shaped popular understanding of the Nazi leadership for decades. Memoirs later shown by historians to contain significant self-serving omissions and distortions about the true extent of his knowledge and involvement. Not every senior Nazi figure faced Nuremberg at all. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS and the chief architect of the Final Solutions operational machinery, was captured by British forces while attempting to flee in disguise using forged papers in May 1945, but he bit down on a concealed cyanide capsule during a medical examination before he could be properly interrogated or tried, dying within minutes and depriving the world of what would surely have been one of the most significant war crimes trials of the entire post-war period. Reinhard Heydrich, who had chaired the Wannsee Conference and served as the brutal protector of Bohemia and Moravia, never lived to see any trial at all, having been assassinated by Czechoslovak agents in Prague in May 1942 in Operation Anthropoid, an act of resistance that triggered the horrific reprisal massacre at Lidis, mentioned earlier. Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary and one of the most powerful men in the regime's final years, was tried in absentia at Nuremberg and sentenced to death, his actual fate unknown for decades and the subject of persistent rumors that he had escaped to South America until skeletal remains discovered in Berlin in 1972 were later confirmed through DNA testing in 1998 to be his, revealing that he had in fact died attempting to escape the city during the final battle for Berlin, taking a cyanide capsule after failing to break through Soviet lines. Josef Mengele, the notorious camp doctor at Auschwitz who conducted horrifying pseudoscientific experiments on prisoners, particularly twins, escaped Europe entirely, living under various assumed identities in Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil, and evading capture for the rest of his life despite intense international efforts to locate him, ultimately drowning after suffering a stroke while swimming off a Brazilian beach in 1979, his death only conclusively confirmed years later through the exhumation and forensic examination of remains buried under a false name. The wives and children of the senior Nazi leadership faced their own varied and often overlooked post-war reckonings, distinct from the formal legal proceedings faced by their husbands and fathers. Emmy Göring, Hermann Göring's second wife, was arrested and interned by Allied authorities and later tried by a German denazification court, which classified her as a fellow traveller and imposed a relatively light sentence, and she spent much of her remaining life defending her husband's memory and complaining, sometimes to sympathetic journalists, about her reduced post-war circumstances. Magda Goebbels, as already discussed, chose murder and suicide over facing any post-war reckoning at all, a decision that meant her surviving relatives were left to grapple, often in silence, with the horror of what she had done to her own children in the bunker's final days. Gerda Bormann, Martin Bormann's wife, fled with her children to Italy in the war's final months, but died of illness in 1946 without ever learning her husband's actual fate. While her children were raised under new identities, some by Catholic institutions, and several of Martin Bormann's children later spoke publicly decades afterward about the profound psychological burden of discovering and coming to terms with their father's central role in orchestrating genocide. These family stories, often overshadowed by the historical drama surrounding the men themselves, offer a different and in some ways more intimate lens onto how the collapse of Nazi Germany rippled outward through households and generations, a theme our channel has explored in much greater depth in dedicated videos on the wives and children of the Nazi leadership. It is also worth pausing on Japan's own post-war reckoning, which followed a notably different path than Germany's. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, convened in Tokyo beginning in 1946 and running until 1948, tried 28 senior Japanese wartime leaders on charges similar to those at Nuremberg. General Hideki Tojo, who had served as Prime Minister for much of the war and bore substantial responsibility for the decision to attack Pearl Harbor, was among 7 defendants sentenced to death and executed by hanging in December 1948, having survived a botched suicide attempt by gunshot at the time of his arrest. Yet unlike at Nuremberg, where the machinery of the Nazi state itself, the party, the SS, and the leadership structure was subject to sweeping condemnation, the Tokyo trials left the imperial institution and Emperor Hirohito himself entirely untouched. A decision driven by American occupation authorities' judgment that preserving the emperor's symbolic authority would ease the practical challenges of governing and reforming Japan, but one that left many Japanese war crimes, including biological weapons experimentation, conducted by the secretive Unit 731 in occupied Manchuria, which killed thousands of prisoners through horrific human experimentation, effectively unpunished, since American authorities granted immunity to Unit 731's leading scientists in exchange for access to their research data, a grim post-war trade-off that remains one of the more troubling and lesser-known chapters of the war's aftermath. The material cost of the war, beyond its staggering human toll, reshaped the global economic order for generations. Europe's industrial and agricultural infrastructure lay in ruins across vast stretches of the continent, and it took years of American-funded reconstruction under the Marshall Plan, formerly the European Recovery Program, launched in 1948 to restore Western European economies to functioning order, an effort that not only rebuilt shattered infrastructure, but also, quite deliberately on the part of American policymakers, aimed to prevent the kind of economic desperation and political instability that had helped fuel the rise of fascism in the interwar period in the first place. The Soviet Union, despite its staggering losses, emerged as one of two global superpowers, its wartime sacrifice and the Red Army's occupation of Eastern Europe, granting it both the material capacity and the political justification for the decades of Cold War competition that followed. The United States, its homeland untouched by bombing and its industrial base actually strengthened by wartime production, emerged as unquestionably the wealthiest and most powerful nation on Earth, a position of dominance that would define the second half of the 20th century. Britain and France, though victorious, found their treasuries exhausted and their global empires no longer sustainable, a reality that would become increasingly apparent through the wave of decolonization that swept across Asia and Africa in the decades following 1945, from India's independence in 1947 to the wrenching Algerian War of Independence against France in the following decade. Technologically, the war accelerated developments that would define the post-war era in ways few could have anticipated in 1939. The jet engines pioneered, however imperfectly, by German engineers found their way into post-war military and eventually civilian aviation, transforming global travel within a generation. Radar technology, developed urgently to detect incoming bombers, evolved into the foundation of modern air traffic control and weather forecasting. The code-breaking machines built at Bletchley Park to crack Enigma represented crucial early steps toward modern computing, with figures like Alan Turing laying theoretical groundwork that would eventually give rise to the digital revolution. And the atomic weapons developed by the Manhattan Project ushered in an entirely new category of geopolitical calculation, one in which the two emerging superpowers would spend the following decades locked in an arms race and a doctrine that came to be known with a certain dark irony as mutually assured destruction, a strategic logic premised on the idea that the sheer horror of nuclear war might paradoxically help prevent it, a theory that has held so far but one that continues to carry the weight of the war's most terrifying legacy. The generation that fought and lived through the Second World War on every side of the conflict has now nearly entirely passed from living memory, and with their passing comes a growing responsibility to ensure the war's lessons are preserved not merely as dates and troop movements memorized for a history exam, but as a genuine, felt understanding of what happens when nations abandon the rule of law, when propaganda convinces ordinary people to view their neighbours as subhuman, and when the ambitions of a small number of ideologically driven leaders are allowed to drag entire societies into catastrophe. Museums, memorials, and archives across dozens of countries now preserve testimony, photographs, and physical evidence of the war's events, precisely because the people who could once speak from direct personal experience are disappearing, and because, as history has shown repeatedly in the decades since 1945, the impulses that produced fascism, genocide, and total war have never been permanently extinguished, only ever suppressed and guarded against through vigilance, education, and institutions deliberately built to prevent their return. Veterans on all sides carried the psychological weight of what they had seen and done for the rest of their lives, often in silence, in an era before societies had developed the vocabulary or clinical understanding to properly address what is now recognized as post-traumatic stress, and it is worth remembering that the war's true cost extended for decades beyond 1945, through the quiet suffering of survivors, veterans, and the families of the tens of millions who never came home at all. What, in the end, can be said about a conflict of this almost incomprehensible scale? It was a war that revealed humanity's capacity for both unimaginable cruelty and extraordinary courage, sometimes within the very same individuals and institutions. It produced the deliberate, industrialized murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others in the Holocaust, alongside acts of quiet heroism by ordinary people who risked everything to shelter the persecuted. It produced generals whose brilliant tactical minds served monstrous ends, and it produced ordinary soldiers, sailors, and airmen who fought and died in staggering numbers for causes both just and unjust. It ended with the detonation of a weapon that permanently altered the calculus of great power conflict, ushering in an atomic age whose shadow, in the form of nuclear deterrence and the ever-present risk of catastrophic escalation, still hangs over international relations today. And it left behind a network of institutions, alliances, and legal principles, from the United Nations to the very concept of crimes against humanity prosecuted at Nuremberg, that the world continues to rely upon, however imperfectly, in the ongoing effort to prevent history's deadliest chapter from ever being repeated. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching this complete journey through the Second World War. If you found this video informative, make sure to check out our video on what happened to the wives of Nazi leaders after the war, and our deep dive into where the Waffen-SS went after 1945, both of which explore in far greater detail some of the individual stories we could only touch on here. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into history. See you in the next one.